Great. There you go.
We ready?
We are. We're live, Dr. Dempsey.
Thank you, Em. Good morning to everybody. Thanks for taking the time to be part of the meeting today and the group. I want to apologize for missing Monday. I had a change in my schedule for Monday, and we got everything arranged except contacting Kim to let her know I couldn't make the meeting. And so I apologize for that for people who were sitting there waiting last week. I hope in the context of a year that is already beyond, I can't imagine not beyond anybody's expectations of what the new year should be. Happy New Year. I hope everybody's healthy and safe and well. I'll tee this up by saying I'm not speaking for the Drive Commission, but I'm speaking for the work that we did as a member, and I'm glad Dr. Graham's here as the chair. But in the name of a commission that did really, really good work, deep work, hard work, important work, once we had made the recommendations to the governor and the governor made them public, part of the way I saw what came next as an individual member was, where are we in things that we can do right now that there's no need to wait. We know that the issue is both obvious and important, and where can we take action immediately? Also, in part, having read Ibram Kendi's work, where were areas where we saw racist practices existing in policy, and we had the leverage and the capacity to change those policies, preferably immediately, but to change those policies. And one of those was in general through Pepsi, and also in particular through the use of CORE as a gatekeeping function in the state of North Carolina, and what gates got kept for whom, given that we use Praxis CORE in our programs in the state. And so that was the premise for my contacting the chairman of the Pepsi Commission with Dr. Graham in the correspondence to recommend that we take on this question in the commission of the elimination of Praxis CORE. And I will say, for my sort of the way I'm approaching this work, I don't see it as creating an argument for eliminating it. I think the case to be made is on the side of why would someone keep it? What is the evidence that the use of the test is serving the interest of educator preparation and the education profession in the state of North Carolina? Because I think, from my own point of view, I think the evidence is weak that it should be kept. And if there is such evidence, I would be glad to hear it. But I approach the conversation and the work that we're going to do from the assumption that it is to be eliminated in the absence of a compelling reason that it should not be eliminated. So, Kim, that's and for everybody, that really is the framing that brought me to Pepsi to request that we do this. And I want to thank Anthony for the leadership he provided to the task force, and thank you for the inspiration to act, Anthony. Let's don't wait to do things that obviously can be done. So, Kim, I just have one other point that may be helpful. And we everybody saw the email from the APA language that was shared. I would also ask, and while I don't know if Tom has gotten back, if we have data at the state level that can be informative to how we do this work and how we make this decision, if we can get an understanding today of what that data might be, I think that would be helpful. I'll let others, Anthony, I don't know if you want to add to what I said about the task force's work, Drive's work, but.
Yeah, thanks, Van, and good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. If I have not seen you and had a chance to engage you thus far. Van, thanks for approaching Patrick to have this conversation. On behalf of the Drive Task Force and the recommendations that we offered to Governor Cooper and the short-term, intermediate, and long-term recommendations in terms of strategies that we offered, specifically looking at diversifying the teacher workforce. And from the Drive Task Force, that's the angle or the lens that I'm taking. what do we do to increase diversity in our teacher workforce? And when we look at the data from the educational testing services around Praxis Core, we see huge discrepancies and disparities relative to the performance of candidates of color, students of color in our educator preparation programs or seeking to be admitted into our EPPs. So it's kind of from that context where the Drive Task Force has a lot of skin in this game, understanding what we can do to eliminate barriers without sacrificing quality. And I want to make certain that I'm saying that and emphasizing that clearly. The intent here is not to sacrifice quality. We want to ensure that we continue to prepare quality classroom teachers. There's no question about it. But to Van's point earlier, I have not seen data for myself that suggests that passing Praxis Core makes one a more effective classroom teacher, nor does it impact retention within the classroom of a candidate. So the case to be made, as Van said, is I would like to see data that suggests that passing Praxis Core does have that type of predictive impact on teacher quality. But I do know from a diversification standpoint, the assessment strips away the number of candidates of color who could enter the classroom who are of color. So it's from the Drive Task Force lens that we really want to study this, talk about it more, and immediately act if we realize that this is a barrier to producing more teachers of color in our classrooms. So again, thanks, Van, and I'll stop there.
Sure.
Dan, can I share a little bit of the context of why I introduced the standards for educational and psychological testing?
Mm-hmm. Please.
Some of you know this is a particular area of interest for me in my own scholarship, and as I saw this topic come up, I reflected on how this would align with the published standards for educational and psychological testing, which is to some degree the gold standard that's used in determining fair and appropriate test use, and is the standards used within the context of legal cases challenging the uses of testing. And the points shared by Van and Anthony get to issues of validity. Are the interpretations and uses and then associated outcomes of this assessment what it's intended? And what evidence do we have? And so that speaks to the validity of the interpretations, uses, and outcomes stemming from the use of this set of assessments. So I thought that an interesting place for this group to look is within the standards itself, and just a quick perusal led to several areas where, Anthony, in particular, some of the things you mentioned, I think align very closely with the language of the standards, and perhaps areas where the current uses and interpretations of the core perhaps do not meet what is established by the standards, and perhaps the extent to which there is evidence may be very weak. I don't know the answer to that. I offered it up to the group as a starting place for us, and the language I provided is a little paraphrased. So I just want to put that disclaimer out there that the specific language in the standards is very easy to access, but I tried to whittle it down a little bit. So let me stop there, but that was the impetus for me offering up those points.
So this is Tom. If I could speak to the data aspect of this, if that's okay, Dr. Dempsey.
Please.
So I think the challenge we have is because this is a test that is that is granted as access to it, that allows access to an EPP, or an SAT score that presumably correlates well enough to performance on those practice exams, that anybody that we could measure in terms of effectiveness would have met those requirements. And so it's different than the licensure exams in that we don't have a sample of teachers that was able to go through the licensure process without this testing, and we could compare the rates or the effectiveness of those teachers who did and didn't. So in other words, we don't have a control group for these folks the way we have for the licensure examinations that we have been able to demonstrate have really no predictive validity in terms of more effective teaching. So that is my concern with is getting to the heart of that question of whether these things predict better performance. I think just really simply put, they just predict performance, future performance, good or bad. I mean, because all the teachers have that. Now, we could examine the question of do higher scores on these tests predict better effectiveness in the classroom by these teachers, and use that to kind of make the argument, well, if we extrapolate this, if there is some kind of trend, or there's not even a trend, can we extrapolate beyond the floor of that to say we would assume that all teachers who meet lower than this threshold have an equal chance of being an effective teacher as evidenced by the data? And just some thoughts on those two approaches. I mean, the problem and the possible approach.
Tom, your latter points where my mind went, that there would not be a comparison group that never got in the EPP. But if the assumption is there's something called a cut score, there's an assumption that performance above and below that cut score is predictive of some later performance. And therefore, a number closer to the cut score would predict less effective performance than a higher number.
Right, I agree with you. If there's no relationship between higher scores on those pre-professional tests and outcome, and teacher effectiveness outcomes, then I think one could make that argument. But we would not be shielded from other attacks to that approach. There could be something magical about that cut score that once you get below it, our inferences no longer apply. And I could see it. If I were on the other side of this equation, I would make that argument. And also, the argument, I'm just trying to play devil's advocate for somebody on the other side of this. Why would we expect increased performance on that pre-professional? That is an entry test. It is the preparation that one receives from the EPP that is the predictive thing of whether you're a better teacher or not that test. It's just establishing a minimum entry requirement. That effectiveness is the result of the preparation one receives, not for passing that cut score.
And Tom, I think it's that point where I have issue with Praxis Core. If we're saying that it's our belief that the treatment of our ed prep programs really serve as the lever for effectiveness as a classroom teacher, then it seems almost arbitrary that we use Praxis Core as one of the entryways into the program. Because if Praxis Core was critically important to our belief about teacher effectiveness, then I think we would also see Praxis Core as a requirement for those people who enter the profession through the alternative pathway. But we don't have that assessment sitting there. So it seems to me, and I know this is philosophical in nature, but it seems to me that we are using an assessment in a very arbitrary way so that we can make an argument that we have assessed people to enter a program. I would make the argument, well, aren't there other ways to assess that knowledge, that skill, whatever it is we're looking for beyond Praxis Core? Does it have to be Praxis Core?
So this is Tom again. I think that is, that's another possible approach to this, is just get away from trying to prove or disprove that these pre-professional scores have some meaning or some predictive validity, and move to really focusing on the fact that we have worked really hard to create an outcome-driven accountability model. What purpose do these inputs serve? This is an input measure. This is not an outcome measure. So we, the EPPs, are willing to hang our hats on the outcomes. So why don't you give us the flexibility to determine who should be admitted to our programs, and we will take the hits on the outcomes if that's what it yields. But I think that, to me, that is a much better argument that would resonate with the General Assembly. Is if we're going to live or die by these outcomes, then why are you imposing these? Why can't we choose whoever we want to be in these programs?
Right. And to, I'm trying to keep a list of sort of points for making the case. Back to Anthony's point, at least at UNC Wilmington and other institutions in other states where I've worked, depending on where you do praxis core, if you're a traditional age student, you might take the test and fail. If you wait 18 months of your life until you've completed an undergraduate degree, whether you go lateral clinical residency or post-baccalaureate certification or a full-blown master's program, it's not even a question. And so there's a fallacy, in my mind, there's a fallacy in the policy that if you can't get in by passing praxis core, finish an undergrad program, just wait 18 months, because then we're not even going to ask you to take it. So I wouldn't word it that way to the General Assembly, but I think it's part of it is this gets back to one of my points earlier. I don't want to default into we have to defend getting rid of it. I think the defense has got to be, why is it being kept? And there's, it sounded to me like we've got at least 4 points that suggest it provides no benefit to the policy decision, and it does significant harm.
Van, and to the group, is there any documentation of the specific interpretations and uses of the praxis core within this context? Like, has the state come out and said, these are the specific interpretations that we're trying to make by virtue of these scores?
Not that I'm aware of.
That's what it sounds that way to me, that there's a great lack of clarity of why these scores are actually being used, with specific reference to the interpretations we're making about current and future teachers.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like that, Randy. That's a great question. The closest thing I've seen is from ETS in terms of its recommendations to states about how they might interpret the results and what it might mean, but I've never seen anything from the state of North Carolina.
And to the points that were made just previously is that one of the tenets that we want to hold up is do no harm.
Right.
We're using assessments, right? Like at the end of the day, and to Van's point, this is the burden should not be on proving that an assessment doesn't do what it's intended to do. The burden should be on gathering evidence showing that an assessment is doing what it's supposed to do and not doing other things that it's not intended to do. So it seems like without real clarity on what the state has decided that the resulting scores and use of this assessment is intended to do, within the context that it does seem to be leading to adverse impact in other areas, this is problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah, Randy, I love that do no harm. That's, I'm thinking about what Van said moments ago. If you want to become a teacher, just wait 18 months and you can enter through an alternative program. The issue there is we make the assumption people will wait 18 months. Oftentimes, they're not going to wait 18 months. They're going to look to a different profession altogether. Yet we continue to say we've got teacher shortages. So we're doing harm. And we don't even know what the purpose of the assessment really is.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Do we have any data that shows any differences between candidates that went through and took the core versus those that did not? I mean, I know we have traditional candidates versus alternative candidates, but the Praxis core, I know we have research on the impact of an SAT score on the quality from Gary back in the day. Has any of that been updated? That's a correlation. I'm just thinking out loud of the correlated research that I know that I've seen in the past for North Carolina.
I'm sorry, Ann, could you tell me the correlation again between SAT and the Praxis core?
So the SAT cutoffs, the Praxis core scores are correlated with SAT scores, right? So if you make a certain score in the SAT, you don't have to take the Praxis core. So those are considered correlated features in my mind, right? A standardized test of some type. So there used to be some research in North Carolina from Gary that showed the impact of SAT scores on teacher quality. I'll say it like that. If I'm not saying that correct, Van, Randy, or Anthony, feel free to jump in. And I believe there were some descriptive things about the impact on teachers of color with that information. That was also part of that discussion. I don't know if anything was written up, but that's always been part of this discussion. The impact of the number of candidates that drop out because of the Praxis core, right? And then, and then Michael Marr has mentioned some research around no impact of Praxis core, right? Like there's no impact of Praxis core. There's not anything that says. So in any of the Kevin Bastian, any of that research, is there anything that can provide us any kind of insight, pro or con? Which I know is what y'all are asking, but I'm asking about specific folks and specific things now.
So here's where I lack a bit of the history on this. With Gary Henry, I don't know if his work led to the establishment of the SAT cut score to substitute for the Praxis, or if it was, the problem we would have with updating that is, if that was the case, then he could have performed that research in a time when people had both SAT, a full range of SAT scores and a full range of Praxis core scores. But my concern today is to update that, we would have some kind of floor effect where you would only have SAT and Praxis core for those people who didn't meet the SAT requirement, and not for those who exceeded it, the SAT requirement, and that would cause us some problems in correlating that. But it's a good thought. But I think if we're recognizing that let's assume there is a correlation, we're still back to the same thing. The SAT, getting the SAT waiver, that SAT waiver is still presenting with the same problem. These are still standardized tests that I think have been demonstrated to have that are problematic for students of color and students of poverty. That it's just a reiteration of the same thing. I mean,
that's right.
Yep.
I'm not. Yeah. The other thing is that many places are going, including my institution, test optional, right? COVID has pushed that forward in a way. So are we going to get to the point where this is an extra? Let's just say we had research that said we should keep this because this made a huge difference, which we do not. It does not seem that we do. We have research that says this is a barrier. But even if we have research that said this matters, this is going to be an extra test burden for folks in general, because if their institution is test optional. So we're saying, in addition, you didn't have to have a SAT score to get in here to be in teacher ed. Now you got to have something else. So there's another cost there that's going to cause another barrier for everyone, right? Which is something I think we also need to take.
Yeah, can I ask a question about that? So I've been curious, just because my son is a senior and applying for colleges now, and testing optional has become quite a big deal. Did institutions, did IHCs approach that testing optional position from a position of, well, we know historically certain high schools, their GPA does correlate strongly with SAT scores or ACT scores, and so we're going to look at the schools they're coming from and their GPAs and kind of proxy it out and say, what would this kid have done probably? Or is it just, in light of the fact that testing was so difficult during COVID-19, we've just jettisoned this for the time being?
Okay, so I'm not going to answer all your question because it depends on the institution about the GPA, the high school, and all that. But I will tell you that the conversations I have been in have been about the barriers to students of color, in terms of that they don't reflect their true ability, that there's testing bias in the SAT.
Okay.
So it correlates with this conversation, right?
Yeah.
In addition to the barrier of getting the test this year with COVID escalated that. That's what I said, that COVID escalated the idea of, we want to think about, is SAT really a indicator? And if it's not going to be an indicator to get into a four-year university or college, then we need to move forward with breaking down this barrier for teachers even more. Okay, right now I've said a lot.
And I just want to add on to that. I think that the issue, like for me, it's not so much is the SAT a correlate of the praxis core. That's not the logical issue. When we use the praxis core to make a decision about a student, there's a set of inferences that we're making having to do with the competency or competencies. This has not been defined in North Carolina, I suspect, but that's in essence what's going on, that we're making an inference about this individual's competencies and how the extent to which they'll be effective in their profession, however we define that, right? That's a whole field, right? And so the issue is not, does the SAT map on to the praxis core? The issue is once we've defined these competencies and the ultimate effectiveness of the teachers, does the SAT actually lead to inferences that are appropriate about that, about this field of competencies, right? We call it, the universe of competencies that are out there. So I think using the SAT as a proxy, there's this added complication here that it's not so much is the SAT actually reflective of the praxis core. I mean, that's a midpoint in it, but it's really is the SAT reflective of these competencies that we're trying to measure and make statements about, right? Make these very important statements about students.
Yeah, and Randy, taking what you just said and connecting it back to Tom's earlier point, to the extent that ACT can substitute or SAT can substitute for PPS for our core, and we have those matched numbers that if you perform this well on one, it equals that on the other. Mm-hmm. So getting back to asking the state to provide the evidence that core is a benefit in the policy arena to the development of the support of the teaching profession in North Carolina, which includes who gets into EPPs. Mm-hmm. We want to see the data that says performance on PPST or its proxy, and we would have those numbers on the entire population of people who've gone through EPPs in the last X number of years. Show us the range of performance on those two tests and the range on whatever data we're going to use on the outcome side, teacher effectiveness or whatever it might be, that those two things correlate. And if the answer to that comes back no, as a member of Pepsi, if I was not a teacher or educator and that had been brought to me, my first question would be, well, why are we asking these kids to take this test? It's not telling us anything.
Right.
Except there are some people out there who believe that Part A, core measures something called reading, writing, and math. And the more mathematically inclined, the better the writer you are, the better the reader you are, as scored on that test, the more likely it is you're going to successfully complete the EPP and become a teacher who's going to have a particular kind of impact on children. I don't think we should, going back to something we've said, I think we should start, as members of Pepsi, start with the question, show us the data that says using this test is providing any benefit to the state of North Carolina. And if we don't have that data, the logical conclusion is we stop using the test. Now, I might add also as a policy/political discussion, we've done that with virtually every other gatekeeping function in the system. You can wait and take the test after you EBA complete. If you don't pass that TPA, you can still become a teacher. If you take it once in the first year, you got 3 years to do this. If you're not A, you're B. I mean, we've knocked down every other gate in the state because we can't make we can't increase salaries to the point of incentivizing people going into the profession. So what have we done? We knocked down every other gate in the name of putting a human being in a classroom, except core. Why are we defending core? We don't have to defend core. The people who are using core have to defend its use.
And Van, just to add on to that, there's another way that other credentialing bodies, like accounting being one of them, the medical boards, the purpose of the test, the mission is actually to protect the public interest, right? That's the purpose. And so then you have to have evidence to back that up. And Van, to your point, to what extent do we have evidence that the use of the core is actually protecting the public interest in education?
Right.
Now, this is Andrew. If memory serves, a couple years back, I think Epic and Bastion did this analysis. Tom, do you remember that? I feel like his answer was it was not connected to teacher effectiveness, with the exception of foundations of
That
reading.
that was licensure exams.
That was licensure. Okay.
Yeah, that was content. And that is true that foundations of reading was the exception.
Okay.
Could
Can we
someone
explore,
check, Kevin, and see if there's any data? That would be great.
I have that presentation I can send everyone. I was looking for it earlier, so I can
Thanks,
send that to everyone.
And I think also back to a point Randy made in this question about do no harm. Even if the data that Kevin might run would come back and suggest there is some credibility to core that we didn't know or we didn't see, there is still the question, is the use of the test in the public benefit of the state of North Carolina? I can tell you at UNCW, on the question of having more teachers, there is no doubt it is an unfair restriction. On the question of diversifying the teaching profession, there is no doubt that it is an unfair restriction. So even if it's more credible than we think it is, and I don't think there's a chance that's the case, it still is doing irreparable harm.
Absolutely.
yes.
Carolina.
Absolutely.
Van, that's great.
Yeah, it goes back to something Ann said earlier, talking about the SAT being test optional and it becoming a test burden for individuals if they had to start taking the assessment. But what about those individuals who still have to take the assessment? It is a test burden, and oftentimes those are your students of color and your students from poverty. So it becomes a burden and it's doing harm. So, again, Randy, your question or your statement of do no harm, critical to this conversation, I believe.
Yep. Yeah, and I just want to throw my weight behind, Van's point. We've all said it. Van, I thought you articulated it really well, that there's this balance that even if you can show a positive correlation, which is, these correlations tend to be very small in magnitude, but even if there is, that doesn't mean a green light to use it. You're balancing the overall impact that the use of this assessment has. And I think that's a critical part to this.
Mm-hmm.
That
Well, we are definitely the choir. So what do we need to
I think, Tom, can you synthesize all that into, it sounds like the data we need is,
Um,
do? Yeah, Tom.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think my concern here is the requirement for the general. So this is a requirement in statute. So we're talking about getting statutory change. I don't know that this original decision to do this was ever a data-driven decision, which makes me question whether a data solution would unravel the requirement. And I mean, I don't know. I'm just the only thing that the only way I can think of doing this is to show in bands of performance on the pre-professional skills. How does that? What does the student growth look like for those teachers? And is it any different? In other words, do we see higher rates of teachers exceeding expected growth on our EBOS measure if they're in a higher band of performance on the pre-professional skills? You know, my guess is we wouldn't, but I don't know. I can't confirm that.
And that's just correlation. That doesn't,
right.
you know, you're going to have affluence running through all this
Right.
that's driving this.
So what? Yes. So would we be in a position where we could control for all the school level effects of where those teachers wound up in their teaching? That has an impact on their performance. I mean, beginning teachers who are in high growth schools tend to have higher growth. There's a kind of community effect going on here with growth that I still don't think we're coming out with a slam dunk. But that doesn't mean we won't try. We won't try anything that you want us to do. I would want to consult with a couple of folks before I tried to go down this path.
and Tom, as a member of Pepsi and as a member of the Drive Task Force, we're not trying to make a scientific case because, as you just said, I don't believe there was one when the test. Probably what there was, a lobbyist from ETS came to Raleigh and said, "Hey, there are 29 other states that are doing whatever, and you should do it too."
Mhm.
I'm glad you said that, and it wasn't me on this.
I'm just saying, let's keep in mind that as was noted earlier, we didn't adopt it on the basis of scientific rationales
Exactly.
and protecting the profession. So we should not be held to that burden. As a member of Pepsi, part of this is the data. But part of it is also the compelling public interest, given the charge Pepsi has as a group. And I might add that another piece of data we can pull into this is if the correlation is questionable, and I think it only has to be questionable. It doesn't have to be conclusively doesn't correlate, but if it's questionable, then we have another set of data is, now let's look at the ramifications of the tool being used in the state of North Carolina over a 3-year period. How many people who wanted to be teachers couldn't get into an undergraduate EPP? What percentage of the people who wanted to get in but didn't get in are Hispanic or African American? And that's the Pepsi's case, is not to present a paper at AERA, is to make a credible, compelling public statement to remove the test. So I'm all for, let's get as much data as we can, but we're a public policy body, not a research center.
Agreed. So my question would be, from the EPPs, would it be possible to get information on folks who applied were not, but did not get admitted because of the practice or the lack of the SAT or the lack of the GPA. I don't think, Andrew, we don't collect that information.
Yeah, we don't collect that.
Yeah.
Would we run into UNC system and NCICU on getting those data?
You could. I think it's going to be institution specific, Tom. I think there may be some institutions that collect data on students who weren't admitted, and there may be some who don't, because the focus obviously becomes on those who are admitted and making sure that that becomes part of the universe of information for CAPE accreditation purposes. So I think it might be hit or miss on what institutions are tracking and monitoring those who are turned away.
And the students are not, test takers are not required to report to DPI.
Then if I register for the test, it's not required for me to put in the code for DPI. I could choose to do so, but I may not. And oftentimes, particularly with students of color that I've seen, they tend not to report those scores to DPI because they think it's going to be used against them in a negative way. So they hold on to the score and report it to the EPP once they've received a passing score, rather than letting everyone know what their report was or their score was.
And my question would be, and maybe this is a question for Andrew, do we, for even those admitted candidates, do we collect data on their praxis core performance?
Well, for admitted candidates, yeah, we have to have that information, and essentially there's an if-then statement in there, which is if I'm admitted and I don't have those test scores, then I need the SAT scores to assure that I have met or exceeded the threshold to not have to have taken those tests. Yeah, and we're changing that this year. We're going to require that everybody's SATs and ACTs, if you have data on candidates, that you're going to submit that. Because what's happening is you're seeing a skewed distribution of the SATs, because only the people that met or exceeded the threshold, all the high flyers, are giving you your SAT score, which is not really an accurate representation. So that's a little information on how we deal with that once they're admitted.
Okay.
So that was a little sketchy. So the department does have the data on people who are admitted. So that gives us some correlation capacity on score on core relative to whatever the outcome measure is going to be. And then the second leg of data is at the EPP level, who did and did not get into the program on the basis of praxis, on basis of core. And whatever number of institutions we have that have the capacity to produce that data, that at least gives us a shaky picture of what that looks like. And also, if they can disaggregate it by race at the institutional level, can they report those numbers to a what is a compelling, Randy? What's a compelling way to have a subset that makes the statement?
Yeah, so I think, we definitely need to have race in there, and if we can talk about other variables too. I'd like to, I'm really interested to see what EPIC's done previously. I want us to be really careful on relying too much on correlations, because I think that this is largely just driven by affluence. And so, part of me feels like saying I'd love to see the raw data that's there, and at the same time, it might be useful for them once we get a better understanding of what exactly is the data that we have and where are the gaps and the holes in the data, to get a sense from them as to how we're going to aggregate this, make sense of it.
So Kim, let's reach out to Kevin and
Okay.
and see what we've got, because when Gary would have done that, he was leading Epic. So this should be in their archives of reporting that they've done, and he should have access to that and could share any reports. I do recall that those presentations to the State Board of Education go back many years, so I can't. I mean, rather than us trying to hunt and search through the SBE meetings, let's see if he got anything on that.
I sent the one that Andrew referred to everyone via email during the meeting. Everyone has that one.
That was the licensure exam, correct?
That was licensure examinations.
All right, and then so what we're looking for here is any work that they've done on Praxis Core.
Right. Okay.
And we'll see if that's there and what they might have come up with. And hopefully they did do some disaggregation by race and maybe even socioeconomic status. So I was very surprised at that.
Let me propose another thought here. And Tom, I zapped you the language from 599 around this minimum admissions requirements. They do say in there that you have to have attained a passing score or prescribed minimum score set by the state board for a pre-professional skills test, but they are not specific as to what pre-professional skills test is being used. So I suppose another route would be to think, well, if the lawmakers are not going to get rid of the notion of a pre-professional skills test, could this group or other groups scratch around to see if there is a better pre-professional skills test that is aligned to the things that we think are valuable in terms of the candidacy that's coming in.
And Andrew, to that point, one of the things where the standards can be really useful here is the standards say that all else equal, if you have multiple possible ways of measuring whatever the competencies are that you're trying to measure, we are obliged to use the one that does the least harm.
Yeah. So in this conversation, I don't want to lose a potential powerful ally in this, and that is the work of the Human Capital Roundtable, who's doing work for licensure reform, and we'll see, and we're seeing that as extending back into the preparation side of this and forward into the professionalism and the compensation side. So it really is about, we're couching this as licensure reform, but it has implications all throughout the teacher kind of life cycle. So I would really say one of the, if this committee in particular think about potential representation on those work groups if they move forward, and we'll know more in February if they're going to move forward or not. But that could be, if this is all packaged within this larger push to the legislature to do licensure reform in North Carolina, I think there might be a better possibility of success than if we're just attacking this as a one-off issue.
Tom, I would agree with that as long as the act to eliminate core doesn't get tied up in a set of recommendations that are going to come later from the group you just talked about. I mean, I think we certainly should make sure we work together collaboratively. But I think if the questions we've put on the table today about core come to the conclusions we think they should come to, then we should eliminate that test at that moment.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So we have 6 minutes.
Okay. Am I hearing from this that an additional request for staff is that we research other possible pre-professional tests that may have been more rigorously vetted for bias in terms of race or affluence?
I do not support that.
Okay.
I don't either.
Okay.
I support the state of North Carolina investing in the development of a set of assessments based on knowledge, skills, dispositions, frame it in whatever language like that we want to use, but assessments that tell us on the front end of a program, this person is exhibiting the capacity to be a teacher.
Okay.
And I actually think we should not go out in search of a test.
I agree.
Yep.
I'm with you. I just wanted to be sure.
But I do think, I mean, so I don't want to declare responsibility for the group, but back to Randy's question, what is it that we can add in a data analysis work that will help us answer the questions that we're talking about? And that's going to require expertise that goes well beyond me.
Mm-hmm. And another point that Randy made, before we start getting into this conversation about creating new assessments or whatever it may be, from my vantage point, we still have not articulated what are the universe of competencies, I'm using Randy's language, that we seek with said assessment. What's the purpose of this thing?
Right.
And if we can't articulate the purpose, then there's no need to go creating assessments.
Yeah.
So I think we really have to kind of back up to the most rudimentary level and ask ourselves, what is it that we're seeking to know? What is it that we're seeking to be able to articulate relative to being able to prepare a classroom teacher who's going to be effective downrange? Until we can articulate those competencies, I just don't see the need for any assessment until we can figure that out.
Agreed. Yeah.
Agreed. Totally agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That resonates with me as well. And it seems to me that in terms of these types of pre-professional skills tests, that what a training program, and I don't, an EPP would be interested in, does the candidate possess the things that we think are important in becoming a teacher that we don't offer training in? So those skills and dispositions that would make for a great teacher, because the piece where we're talking about this person needs training, that's what you're providing. So why would you exclude someone?
Right. Exactly.
Exactly.
In a position to provide, you would exclude someone because they don't have those things that are important that you don't provide. And by that, I would say those are more dispositions and values that these folks hold, not skill in
Exactly.
writing and arithmetic, which is the very thing that you're purporting to train them in. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah. And is there an agreement among this group that we're answering two different questions? One is, do we continue with the use of core? And the second is, what is the information that we need to know? What is the way that we're going to, the set of characteristics, the current competencies that need to use to determine who can enter the pre-professional phase of the program? But the elimination of core should not be contingent upon having the answer to the other. Once you have the answer to that, we'll get rid of core. So that's its own question that sits or not on its own bottom. So is Tom, can you articulate what you think the next steps are again?
No. So I think we're going to look for any research that we've got from EPIC, prior research on this question, look at it and see how it was done. Can we replicate it? Or was it unique to that time period and under a different set of policies? The second thing that I think we move towards here is an examination I mean, I think it's reasonable work for us to do to look at the current relationship between higher performance on these professional skills tests and teacher effectiveness. I think that's within our capability, and we could move on that. And that would be kind of for committee consumption only. It's not something that we would necessarily throw out there for the world. And then I really think that kind of driving home this idea that that the EPP schools, EPP, K-12 public schools and EPPs have really shifted to an outcome-based accountability model, and what purpose then does this serve other than to stymie EPPs in recruiting candidates of color and candidates in general, when if we're making bad decisions, that's going to manifest in the outcome data anyway.
Right.
Why are you constricting our ability to attract candidates, but also holding us to this quality standards on the back end? The former seems redundant in light of the latter, or unnecessary.
And when we think we're close enough to having some grasp of that, Kim, you'll help us set up a next meeting?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do we have, we're over time. I'll ask the question at a later date.
Well, I'm fine.
Do we have evidence, do we have data on, so part of this is the test is, the current core is potentially preventing individuals from entering the teaching workforce who will not be effective as educators, right? I mean, that's the assumption that's being made, right? If you don't pass this test, then there's a good chance you're not going to be effective down the road. So that's kind of the arena that we're playing in right now. But then there's the other side of it, which is the harm part, which is now, how many times is the use of this test leading us to make an error because there was someone who did not apply or was not admitted into the program who would have been a highly skilled educator and highly effective? Do we have data, or can we collect data on that other side? The kind of the gatekeeping component of the current use of this assessment? I know, Anthony, in the drive report, there was some information there.
Yeah, but it's limited. What we had was limited, Randy. And I think that the other side is the part that I'm most interested in, but it seems to be the part that's the most difficult to gather. So I'm not sure what that looks like or how we could go about grabbing data in that space.
Yeah, well, let me make sure I'm understanding what you're getting at here, because I don't think it's as narrow as what I'm thinking. It would be really interesting to see examples of students who were enrolled in your institutions that applied for the EPP, were denied, and then went on to complete their undergraduate degree, and then take the residency route into the system, and how did they perform? I think it would be very compelling. The challenge we're up against, though, is not to compare those candidates to that particular subset of folks to the program completers who were admitted to an EPP. We compare them to the other residency licensed people, entry license. Right. That's really the comparison group, because we know on average traditional prep folks perform much higher than candidates alternative routes. So we want to make sure we're making apples to apples comparisons there, but I think it's a really, it could potentially be a powerful statement, if we could get the data.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, Tom. I think that all of that hinges upon the EPP collecting data on those students who were denied and then being able to continue to track them that they were, moving into a residency. I just don't know how many of our EPPs track data on students who were denied.
Well, to that point, if you just had the tracking, I think is somewhat immaterial. If you had a list of candidates that were denied admission to the EPP, we could bump that up against licensure data to see who's showing up.
Well, let me clarify, Tom. I'm sorry. Most students who don't pass Praxis Core never apply.
I got you.
So having a list of those students may be problematic. Yeah, I think some institutions would have those who did apply, but for the most part, if I never pass Praxis Core, I'm not going to complete the application because I'm not going to be admitted. It's a requirement to be admitted into the program. So may not have a list on those students that would be comprehensive and accurate. I'm not sure. That's the question.
But Anthony, the institutions, at least some of them, would have, like at UNCW, if somebody applied to go into the teacher education program, were denied because of core.
Mm-hmm.
Come back later to our program at the post-baccalaureate level for a certificate for clinical residency or for MAT, and they're admitted and ultimately become teachers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a good enough statistician to know how that would be modeled out.
Right.
Let's say out of 54 institutions, how many, they should all have that capacity because they know who's on their list at that point in time as an undergraduate, and they run that against the list of people in their certification programs at the post-baccalaureate level, and you'd have the common set.
Mm-hmm.
Did that make sense?
It makes sense. I think we're going to have to talk with the EPPs to see who's doing what. I'm just not certain that there's going to be that standardization where everyone's, I'm thinking about a new freshman in the first semester who takes the Praxis Core, won't tell a soul that they took it. They don't pass it, and then they're gone. And the EPP never really got a chance to know that they were in line to go into, the application process. So that's the only challenge. I don't know how complete the data set would be, but having some data may be better than having no data at all.
Right. I have to jump off to chair another meeting. Kim and Tom, you'll be in touch and we'll meet again.
Yes. Thank you, Van.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This is great.
Everyone,
All right.
Thank you.
take care.
Bye.
Hey, Tom, are you staying on for a second?
We need to not be, Tom's off.
Okay.
Thank you, Lawrence. We're done.